Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel to get updates on our upcoming videos. Also, follow us on our social media platforms or send us your message through our Gmail address.
So this video will be about the transport mechanisms involved in cells. So these are your passive and active transport. So before we proceed, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Okay, let's start now. So in terms of the transport mechanism of solutes, we can classify them into two, either as the movement of small molecules, namely these are your uh, passive transport and active transport, and on the other hand, it's the transport of larger molecules. So under this would be the exocytosis and endocytosis, okay, both of which will be further discussed later on. Okay, now in terms of the transport of small molecules, we can uh, categorize them into two. So you have your passive transport versus your active transport. Okay. Now the main difference here is in terms of the movement of solute. So the movement of solutes here are either, so for active transport, this is against the gradient. So meaning to say it's from low concentration to high concentration. On the other hand, for passive transport, this is along the gradient, meaning to say this is from higher concentration to lower concentration. Okay, so this is one parameter, but how we can differentiate your passive and active transport. Another way to differentiate this is through the use of ATP. Okay, so for active transport, since the movement is against the concentration gradient, this would require ATP use. Okay. On the other hand, for passive transport, it does not require ATP use. Okay. Now, furthermore, we have different types of passive transport mechanisms. So under this, you have your simple diffusion, wherein solutes would just move passively across the membrane. So in order for solutes to move passively across the membrane, it must have these three characteristics, which are uh, it must be small, it must be non-polar or lipid soluble, okay, and the third one is it must be uncharged. Okay, so example of this would be your gases, carbon dioxide. What else? Water would be an exception. Okay, and other very small uncharged fatty acids. Okay. Another transport mechanism under passive transport would be your facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion. Okay. Now for facilitated diffusion, you have two other examples here. One would make use of ion channels and would make use of transporters. Now, the key difference here between simple and facilitated is that when we say facilitated, it requires a protein in order to uh, allow the diffusion of the substance. So it can either be an ion channel. So for an ion channel, these are integral proteins that are gated. So when we say gated, they have gates that can either open or close. So if it opens, that's the time that the ions can move into or out of the cell, depending on the concentration gradient. Transporters, on the other hand, these are also integral proteins that bind to specific solutes, and upon binding would have a conformational change in order to facilitate the movement of the solute through the membrane. Okay? So, so looking closer on your ion channels, again, as mentioned previously, these are integral proteins that are gated that can either that upon which when the gate is open, it would allow the movement of the ions. Now there are three general types of ion channels that wherein the gate would open depending on the stimulus applied. So for example, in first one is your voltage gated uh, ion channels that are that would actually open in response to changes in the membrane potential. Okay. Another example is the ligand-gated ion channels. These are ion channels that would require the binding of specific ligands such as your acetylcholine in order to open the gates and to allow ions to diffuse or to enter. Okay. And the last example would be the mechanically gated. So from the name mechanically gated, so the gates here are mechanically open or closed, such as in baroreceptors. Okay, so the main stimulus here are of mechanical type. Yeah. Next one would be the transporter proteins. So again, these are under your facilitated diffusion. And in this transport mechanism, you have your proteins, your integral proteins that would bind to specific solutes that would facilitate the transport of that solute or molecule, either passively or actively. Now, to illustrate, so for example, this is the uh, cell membrane. Okay. So for example, you have the integral protein here. Okay. For example, this is the extracellular side, extracellular fluid, and this is the intracellular fluid. So for example, the solute, so initially, for example, the transport protein is opening on towards the extracellular side. So the solute would bind to it. Okay. Now upon binding of the solute to the transporter protein, the transporter protein would in turn uh, have a change in the configuration. So instead of facing outward, it will now face inward. Okay, and together with it, it will carry with it the solute. So as a result, the solute is sort of transported from the extracellular to the intracellular site. Okay. Now, transporter proteins can be differentiated or classified either as passive or active. I think this was mentioned previously, in a sense that when we say passive diffusion, the movement is along the gradient and it does not require energy. On the other hand, active transport would refer to the movement being against the concentration gradient and it requires the use of ATP. So an analogy here would be it's like when pushing a rock downhill or uphill. So in passive transport, so think of it as pushing a rock downhill, which is you have a rock here and you push it along gravity. So this would require minimal energy in order for the rock to move downward. On the other hand, On active transport, on the other hand, it's like you are pushing a rock uphill. So since the movement is opposite to the movement of gravity or to the direction of gravity, it will require more energy. Okay? Look at the different types of transporters. Now, I'm sure you've seen in the previous slide, the transporters can be classified as passive or active transporter. Now, another way to classify transporters is based on the number of solute it carries or transports, as well as the direction by which the solutes are transported. Okay, so number one would be your what we call as your uniporter. So from the name uni, it would mean that it only carries a single solute. Okay. Okay. Another one is what we call as your co-transporter. So from the name co-transporter, meaning to say it carries more than two or more rather. Yeah, two or more solutes. Okay. Now we can further subdivide this co-transporter into two. Okay. One is the antiporter. From the name anti, meaning the direction is an opposite. The manner by which the solute are transported on opposite directions. And then the other one is symporter. From the name sim, meaning to say similar, same direction. Okay. Okay. So another category of transport mechanisms would be the transport of large molecules. Specifically, under this, you have two, your endocytosis and exocytosis. Now, depending on the movement of the large molecules, either if it's into the cell or out of the cell. Okay. So, for example, you have a cell here. For example, this is the cell, this is the nucleus, and you have organelles in it. So, if the movement is into the cell, for example, you have another cell here, smaller cell, that's taken up by this big cell. This is termed as your endocytosis. So in other words, it's like your cell is eating something. Okay. Okay. So the movement is into the cell. Now, we can further subdivide your endocytosis into two processes depending on the state of the molecule being taken up. So for example, if it's liquid, it's more of a pinocytosis. So for example, these are liquid or somewhat smaller molecules. This is termed as your pinocytosis. However, for large solid molecules, for example, other cells, okay, this is termed as your phagocytosis. So this is your pinocytosis here, and this is your phagocytosis if it takes up another cell. So of course, on our cell, you have metabolic byproducts. For example, you have toxic byproducts here that are that must be excreted, for example. Now, there's also a process, and this is termed as your exocytosis. So in this process, you have the the product which is originally produced or inside the cell and is transported extracellularly to the extracellular environment. So this is termed as your exocytosis. Okay, so here are the references. So before ending, don't forget to, again, hit the like button and subscribe. Okay. Thank you.